Hi, my name is Amanda Williamson. I'm uploading this video for my NAU Com 301 class with Dan Foster. This is my Subverting Dominant Ideology presentation, and yeah, here it goes. The gender present in the 1980s cult John Hughes classics has kind of a history of being negative towards women. I think John Hughes in general kind of has a history of being negative towards women, despite the really high presentation of women that he does give. And so I've chosen today to talk about The Breakfast Club, his 1985 cult classic that does remain very, very popular even to this day. The ideology presented in the movie is really not necessarily towards women, but very constricting for gender lines in general. And so I have chosen to reconstruct some of the elements in the original ideological chain to see if I can make it a bit less negative towards women and in gender in general. So The Breakfast Club was written in produced in 1985. It's a story of 5 kids who are all very different. There's the criminal, the princess, the brain, the jock, and the weirdo. And they are all sentenced to a Saturday detention together. And at first, they're real kind of resistant to the idea of being friends with or associating with each other. And eventually, they get into this whole kind of series of trials and tribulations through the day. And they become a lot closer, and they share their secrets, and they kind of break out of those kind of normative, stereotypical rankings of jock and princess and brain and things like that, and they end up coming together. And the idea that the viewer is left with is that they're going to continue to be friends outside of detention, but unfortunately we don't really know that because it is high school. So in the original story is not so much negative towards women, and again, it is partially a sign of the times. It's just fairly restricting as far as stereotypes go, which is also a sign of movies of that time, because movies of that time were very big on maintaining the gender and racial stereotypes that were present in society in the 1980s America. So the original chain has a couple of links that I think are really important. It's got attraction or relationships, I kind of put as one chain, beauty, and the heteronormative gender lines, which I think are very important. So for the original chain in this, the attraction link, there was a couple of entailments that really did stick out to me. Abusive relationships, these tropes that seem to exist in relationships, the stereotypical tropes, and the standard definition of beauty, which also does move into the second chain of, the second link of beauty. But inside of these entailments, there are a couple of examples of the way that their chain is constructed that I thought was interesting. Not so much abuse, but Claire puts up with quite a bit of crap from John Bender. He is really very mean and not, again, I wouldn't call it verbal abuse, but it's really skating that line there. And she ends up dating him anyway, and the implication is that she loses her virginity to him in the broom closet. And I don't think that happens to be a very positive message towards women. I think that's, again, kind of a sign of the times, as the girls like the bad boy kind of thing, but which moves into the trope of relationships. The bad boy gets the girl, the athlete at the end gets the girl, Andrew ends up, there's the implication that he's going to end up hooking up with Allison, and the nerd gets no one. So these kind of stereotypical tropes on relationships exist, where exactly what you think is going to happen in the movie, and the nerd gets left alone. So the third entailment of this would be the standard definition of beauty, which would come along with Allison and Andrew. Claire goes really far out of her way to give Allison this nice, preppy princess girl makeover, and she comes out of it and she looks really nice. She looks very well put together and very beautiful. And it's not until that moment when she comes out looking totally different that Andrew even looks at her twice, and they have this really kind of gazing, like, intimate, emotional moment, and it's implied that they're going to end up getting together. And she was pretty before she got her makeover, and he didn't care then. It wasn't until she fit the kind of more standard societal definitions of beauty that she became attractive in his eyes. Which does move on to my next chain, which is beauty. The standard definition of beauty, I think, is very important in that. Claire is valued for her beauty, and that's about it. She's considered the princess, the rich girl, the beautiful girl, and she's considered to be unintelligent because of it. Her parents kind of talk down to her. The rest of the group kind of talks down to her. She's considered as the typical pretty dumb girl, and it's kind of that stereotype that exists that I think is very harmful. And again, Allison wasn't considered beautiful until she was changed. She was beautiful by, not necessarily normal standards, but she was still a good-looking girl, and it wasn't until she fit the Claire model of beauty that she suddenly stopped being invisible. And I think that's a real harmful aspect of their chain towards women in particular. Which moves along to the construction of gender lines as one of the as one of the links. The gender lines are really kind of very strict in this movie. Men will be men and women will be women. For example, in that really emotional sharing scene that they had where they're talking about their secrets and how they got into detention, the other men other than Brian, have this kind of hegemonic masculinity where they're, John gets beat on by his dad, which is a real kind of male masculine problem, and Andrew has the same kind of problem where he's being pressured by his dad to perform well physically, which is again kind of this hegemonic masculine problem that exists within this one type of masculinity. Brian obviously has a sense of masculinity. He is a man, but he has kind of a less physical, less of this real prominent hegemonic masculinity that's present in these other men. So he's kind of lumped in with the women as emotional, as weaker. And that's a very present undertone in the scene, is that the men are really kind of physically reactive, and Brian is just kind of very quiet and crying. And so he's kind of lumped in with the men there, with the women there, and it gives this impression of this real distinct separation of genders based on ideas of masculinity. And I think that's harmful. So I decided to change, not necessarily the chains. I thought the chains were, the links. The links were important aspects of the ideology the way that they were. I just think it was important that they could be changed, because I think the story could be exactly the same, have the same message, the same character conflict, the same all of these things, without being quite so gender restrictive. So I chose to change the interpretation of the entailments of these links instead of actually changing the links or the entailments themselves. So the new one that I looked into, attraction relationships, instead of putting up with this abusive relationship, which is an accepted ideology in the original, the original form of ideology, Molly Ringwald could just not put up with any of John Bender's crap and stop accepting the abuse and take that out of the standard ideological chain for that society where that is accepted. She could just choose to make it not accepted and not put up with it and not lose her virginity to him in the broom closet. I think that would be an important message for women, to show that they don't have to put up with that kind of treatment, and it wouldn't alter the story at all. It would change the very last 5 minutes where Molly Ringwald's hooking up with John Bender, but other than that, the entire story, their character conflicts, everything would be exactly the same, which I think is important. These tropes on relationships could also change without having any real effect on the story. Men and women, big shocker, can actually be friends. They could have constructed this movie where the bad boy doesn't get the girl, the athlete doesn't get the girl. They don't have to have these real heteronormative, stereotypical types of relationships. They could have just continued to remain in this little friendship zone that they had. And again, the story would have been exactly the same. They would have had the same character development, same everything else. It's just they wouldn't have had these that romantic kind of push that I think the audience goes for sometimes. I don't think it was particularly effective in this film. I think it was harmful in this film, and I think it could be done without. The next entailment inside of this chain, the standard definition of beauty. How about the crazy girl doesn't change? She doesn't change the way that she looks, and the standard definitions of beauty are either non-existent in this link, or they have been pushed so far to the side that they're no longer relevant in the society where standard definitions of beauty don't exist, and other definitions of beauty could come into play, like Allison, who was beautiful the whole time. And I think it would be effective if they did it like that, and she still gets the attention of the guy. I mean, I think that would have been a really, really positive kind of message for women and for gender in general, I think. And instead, they chose to leave it with these standard definitions of beauty, which does bring into the next link, beauty. Emilio Estevez can have been attracted to her before she got beautiful. I mean, I think that would have been a real positive change to this standard definition of beauty idea that they have going on in the film. And also, another thing they could have done to change that Molly Ringwald could have been the brain instead of the princess, which would have completely revisited the idea of this stereotype. It would have just shot out of the water if you can be pretty and intelligent. And it would really kind of maintain the chain, the link in the chain, which I think is important. I think beauty is an important part of their world, but I think they could have redefined it to where beauty was not the standard definition, the societal standard definition of beauty did not control these characters as much as it does. And finally, the gender lines, if they had changed it so that different genders had problems outside of their real kind of heteronormative gender lines, where if the men had the real more emotional problems and the women had the more physical problems, or people could just all have the problems that they have. It doesn't have to remain inside this really kind of strict idea of hegemonic masculinity versus this real weak emotional femininity. And I think it would have been really effective to have it like that. And again, it would not have changed the story at all. The characters could have still had the same problems, just different kinds of problems. So I think that this new ideological chain could keep the story exactly the same. It would have the same message, again, same characters. It would still end with the cute, kitsy little letter at the end. It just wouldn't have this real negative effect towards women, and that's what I think, again, that John Hughes is famous for, is he takes these really, really good stories and he puts them into real negative gender lines, and I think the story could have been exactly the same without doing that. I don't think that the gender ideology present in this story, the original gender ideology, is quite as prominent as John Hughes maybe made it out to be. I think that a lot of this gender stuff could have been done very, very differently to still be a very, very positive light towards these women and men, and not have been quite as constricting for the genders. So yeah, the reconstructed artifact would be one with a different kind of set of gender roles and gender lines, and the ideology would have the same chain, the same chain, same link, just different entailments inside of that link. And I think the story still could have been a really effective, positive message about gender while still telling the story that was intended to be told with The Breakfast Club. And again, a part of that is a sign of the times. It was made in the 80s, but there was a lot that could have been changed to show that we don't have to accept this kind of rampant sexism either in our lives or in our media, and I think that's something that John Hughes chose to do, but as an ideology that could be very easily manipulated and changed inside of this fictional world that they have. They could view their world very differently through this ideology. So that is my presentation. Thank you very much.